And yes. And welcome to this questionnaire design webinar. My name is Feli. For those who might not know me, Feli Chitenkot. I'm the head of institutional research and analytics in the office of the provost. And in a moment, you'll hear from my colleague Banu, who is a wonderful survey coordinator in institutional research and analytics. And she will walk you through the questionnaire design process. This is a huge topic, I realize, and we cannot cover it within an hour. Instead, what Banu will do is share with you some practical considerations and tips for writing good survey questions. And this webinar builds upon the 2 previous webinars we offered in 2021. Some of you attended those 2 webinars. The recordings are still available on our institutional research and analytics website. Please, if you have not yet had the chance to check them out, please do so, because it is really imperative that you get familiar with the ideas and concepts that Banu introduced in those two webinars before you even consider writing a single survey question, especially if you are working on a survey instrument or you plan to design and implement a survey in the future. And I also want to mention that ultimately, when it comes to survey research, ultimately your purpose is to collect high quality data that will help you answer very important questions that you have. So the design aspect of any survey instrument is a really crucial step. It is even more important than any data analysis that you'll perform once you collect the data. So it is also important that you understand, or that we understand, that for each question that you include on the survey, there are essentially 2 statistical values. The first value is what you will derive from the information that respondents provide you, okay? And the second value is the true and actual response out there in your population of interest. So this is very important. So for instance, if I ask you to tell me how long you have been working at NU and to report this value, let's say in years and months. So each of you will give me a response, and at the end, I will be able to compute an average, okay? And I would certainly hope that that average corresponds to the true value, the actual value. For instance, the value that I would get if I simply go to HR and ask HR to tell me exactly when each of you started working at NU, because that will be more objective data. So I'll be able to compute an average based on data that HR provides. And then I can compare the average that I computed based on the information that you provided to the value that I have based on HR data, and I will see if the 2 values are the same, or at least close to each other. So in survey research, really what we want is, we want the value that we generate based on the information that respondents provide to be the same, or at least very close to the true value, okay? So in other words, we want to minimize the discrepancy between the 2 values. And that difference is what is called error, survey error. At some point, I think we'll talk a little bit about this. But we really want our value, the value that we generate from the data, to be very close to the true value. The farther away the 2 values are, the poorer the design process is. So it is really important that we understand that the responses that we get from survey participants can be affected by a variety of issues. And some of these issues will be under your control. There are others that might not necessarily be under your control. And one issue that is certainly under your control is the way you design your survey instrument and the way you implement it. This is under your control. the way you write survey questions, that's under your control. So there is a lot of things that you can do at this stage, actually, to improve the quality of the data that you produce. So Banu will share some practical things, some practical tips and considerations that you can use to improve the quality of the data you collect. So please feel free to ask questions. You can also type in your questions in the chat. I will try to monitor the chat, and at the end, we'll have some time for discussions. I'll also maybe try to answer some of the questions in the chat, or we can wait until Banu finishes her presentation. But you can also feel free to interrupt her if you have some burning questions that you feel need to be addressed before we move to the next topic. All right, the session is recorded, as you may have observed, and the recording will be available on the Institutional Research and Analytics website, and it will be available to you. Okay, so Banu, I will turn over the screen to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Polly. That was a great introduction, and you've already touched upon some important topics. I am, my name is Banu, for those who we haven't met before. As Polly said, I'm a survey coordinator within Institutional Research and Analytics. And today we will be talking about questionnaire development. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. As Feli mentioned, today's webinar is actually built on the two previous webinars that we delivered in the fall semester. And however, I anticipate that this might be one of the most demanded topics, how to design a questionnaire, how to write the questions, because when we're usually approached with some to provide some help or assistance with the survey, usually most of the questions are regarding how to write good questions or what kind of questions to write. So, however, I will again today have to go back to the previous webinar and talk about research objectives. This is something that we talked a lot in the previous session, and we've said number of times that writing good research objectives, clear and specific research objectives, it's actually very helpful. And I want to show you today a little bit how it is helpful, because it can be a foundation for writing actual survey questions. For example, I want to give you a very brief example of alumni survey. This is a survey actually that we launched just today. So the research objectives of this alumni surveys is, the purpose of the alumni survey is to provide information and insight on alumni occupation, achievements, perception of academic and non-academic experiences, social and civic engagement, and inclination and capacity to support ANU. So this is something that we've established well before writing a single survey question in this alumni survey. And then when we move to the next stage of writing actual survey questions, this is how we transformed research objectives into actual survey questions. For example, one of the objectives was to learn about alumni occupation achievements, and therefore we think about asking questions where currently the graduates are employed, whether they have pursued education or started their own business, and etc. Another research objective is perception of academic and non-academic experiences at ANU, and the survey, one of the survey question focuses is how different set of how ANU experience contributed to knowledge, skills, and personal development of an alumni, and or how to gain information about social and civic engagement. We focus on asking alumni how often they've engaged in some professional, political, or other volunteering activities. So this is again just to demonstrate how important can be writing good research objectives, because they can be a good foundation to build your actual survey questions. So when you are starting to develop a survey instrument, these questions can be helpful to determine what to actually ask your survey population. What are the issues that are important to cover? What decisions do you need to make with the help of a survey? So what is the decision you're trying to make, and you are gathering information, and you are using survey as an instrument to gather this information? What information is critical for the decision making, and what is just an interesting fact that you would like to learn? And also, I think it's very important to also ask yourself whether there are other sources that could be used to get this information or to supplement the information that you need. So having said that, this is sort of gives you an overall guidance when you actually start writing questions, to think about what kind of questions should you ask. And further in this presentation, this is the things that I want to cover. First of all, why writing good survey questions matter. I want to briefly touch upon types of questions that are out there. And then, as Feli mentioned, this is a very broad topic, and there is actually a lot of theoretical material that needs to be covered to understand the whole design process. But I know that, and there is actually a lot of information out there about it, but I know that most of the people, at least those who approached us, they usually look for more practical tips, things that could be easily implemented or referred to. So in this webinar, I try to cover more like practical tips, things that you can always easily think about or easily spot some of the errors while designing a survey. But of course, it is not it is impossible to cover everything in this survey, in this presentation. So today I will just focus about things to avoid when writing good survey questions, things to be careful with, and like as a summary, general guidelines to writing good survey questions. So so why writing good survey questions matter? To be able to fully answer this question, we wanted to show you the mental processes in which the participants engage when answering a survey question. So first of all, they go through a comprehension of the question stage. It's the stage when they have to understand the question. Second, retrieval of information, when they have to actually search their memory and think about the response, think about the information that they need. Third is judgment and estimation, when they pull out this information from their memory and they have to make a judgment or an estimate, sort of process this information. And fourth is reporting an answer, actually selecting or writing an answer to the survey. And problems can happen at each of this mental process. And I want to go briefly on each stage and provide you examples of problems that can occur. First of all, comprehension of the question. Okay, so the main question is here, will the respondent understand the survey question? It is as simple as that. And the respondent may misinterpret the question or not understand the question. First of all, because maybe they're not understanding the individual words. if you are using some specific terms, unfamiliar terms, abbreviations, and jargons, this will confuse the respondent. And the second, when the respondent understands each individual word, they know the meaning of each individual word, but they might not understand or misunderstand the overall meaning of the question. Okay, for example, the question, have you continued your education after graduating from NU? In this question, this could be interpreted in a number of ways. Continuing education can include, so someone can think about short training, courses, workshops, as well as actually earning an academic degree. So when answering to this question, the respondents can have different understanding of this question. Whereas when you word it as, have you enrolled in an academic program after graduating from NU? This question is more specific and targets, well, specifically defines what kind of education they are talking about, that it is an academic program. So this is the example of a problem that can occur at the first step of the mental process. Second is retrieval of information. So after the respondent have they understood the question, he or she needs to recall the relevant information from the memory. They have to search their memory and find the necessary information. And at this stage, time plays a critical role. By time, I mean, first of all, specific time period. It is very important to specify a certain time period, because otherwise, if the time period is too long or it's not indicated at all, it will require more effort from the respondent to search his or her memory to find the relevant information. And another aspect of time is that how much time has passed since the event. This is also very important, and as you may guess, more time has passed since the event, it's more difficult to remember the and retrieve necessary information. And at this stage, some problems can occur. Maybe respondents will report not very accurate data. For example, let's consider an example. How many courses were taught in English in your secondary school? And you can compare it with the second wording. During the last 2 years of secondary school, how many courses were taught in English? For the first question, it is ambiguous. What time period should the respondent think about the entire secondary school experience, the recent secondary school experience, etc. Whereas when you give when you specify the time period, it will be much easier to calculate the average calculate the average of how many courses were taught in English. And another thing here to consider is that it will be quite different to ask this question to a person who just graduated from high school and a person who just completed his or her PhD degrees. Of course, as you can guess, those who just got out of the high school, they will have very little problem, much less problem answering this question compared to a PhD graduate. So please keep in mind to think about the time frame when asking a question. The third step is judgment and estimation. Judgment and estimation is basically when you have found the information in your memory, but now you have to process it to be able to provide an answer. One of the examples, this can also take many shapes and forms, but today I just want to provide one example to you. For example, behavioral frequency estimation strategies and the problems that can occur. So basically, when somebody is asked, how often did you engage in certain behavior or in certain activity during the past certain time period? First approach that can be used, and when a person actually tries to sit and think about each case when they engage in certain behavior and count. This strategy usually might result in underestimation, because it's more likely that you forget about an event than you actually invent a memory in your head. The second strategy is rate-based estimation. So when you think you engaged in this activity certain times a week, and you multiply it just to get the overall number. This usually leads to overestimation, because, of course, for very regular and frequent activities, it is okay, but people tend to forget about exceptional cases when things didn't happen, certain behavior didn't happen. And the third is more vague. It's impression-based estimation. So when a person doesn't even count or estimate, but thinks, oh, I think I've engaged in this activity a lot, and they just report sort of a bigger number. So translation of impression into a number. So just to provide an example, how many times did you use Moodle in the last month? If you ask this question a student, first student can actually recall and recount from the memory how many times they've used the platform. Second, they might think, oh, I use it at least 3 times a week, so probably it's about 12 times a month. And impression-based estimation, user thinks that they use the Moodle a lot, and they just think about the big number, like 20, more than 20 times. So as I said, in each of these strategies, there is a chance of encountering into a problem, or either underestimating or either overestimating. The last step in the mental process is reporting an answer. So when a respondent actually translates a judgment or estimation they have retrieved from the previous stage and translate it into an answer category. In order to minimize problems at this stage, answer categories or response categories must be exhaustive. They need to include all or almost all possible scenarios and categories. All the response categories need to be labeled, have a clear indication which response option is means what. And also, what is important is that answer categories should not overlap. There should be. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later in this presentation. And if you do not have a good response options, you do not have good answer options, there is the likelihood that a respondent will make a mistake will increase significantly, and they will report. Basically, you will have poorer data at the end of your survey. Let's take an example. How many times did you use Moodle in the last month? And we have response categories 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and more than 30. I would like to ask today's audience, do you think this is, do you think everybody will be comfortable answering this question? If I can, if maybe can somebody type in the chat or just volunteer and answer. So do you think this is okay question and everybody would be comfortable responding to this one?
What about never?
Yes, yes, Madina, thank you. That is correct. Yes, this in the previous version, the response options did not include an option of did not use or never used, because there might be instances when some students did not use Moodle. So this is, again, one of the examples how response, writing good response options can minimize survey error and problems. And
okay, Banu, let me just make a very quick comment here. And this is part of what is we refer to as building in assumptions in your response categories. Because if they are not exhaustive, you have 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and more than 30. So this question automatically assumes that all the potential participants used Moodle. So you always need to think about that category of participants who might not necessarily have used these resources, which is the reason why Banu indicated, added this extra response category, did not use, because there's always a chance that you'll have respondents who actually did not use Moodle. So you don't want to exclude them and build the response categories based on specific assumptions. So be wary of assumptions when you develop survey questions, but also response categories.
Thank you, Feli. Yeah, so to sum up, writing good survey questions is critical. It is one of the, in survey actually, just like Feli mentioned before, there are things that you cannot control, but one of the things you can control and you should control is the quality of the survey instrument. So writing a good survey questions, building a good survey instrument will minimize the problems at each step that the respondent engages while responding to the survey, and overall increase the quality of the data that you receive as a result of the survey. So next, I want to briefly talk about types of questions that could be used in a survey. First of all, types of questions by the question content. First type is factual questions, questions that ask about facts. Demographic questions are a very good example of such questions. For example, asking what year did you complete your secondary school, what is your gender, what is your date of birth. The factual questions are very important. They are usually aimed to understand the respondent. And the reason why they're important is these questions come in handy when you do survey analysis, when you have to compare your survey respondents with the survey population. This is something we've talked about in the previous webinar. And most of the surveys, if they're not non-anonymous, unless you can pull some background data, they should include at least some factual information to be able to do some analysis after your survey is over. The second type of question is behavioral questions. These are basically questions about activities that people engage in or behavior of people. They can also be factual. One of the example is, how often did you use the library in this last academic semester? Or just like we talked previously, how often did you use, how many times did you use Moodle in the last month? And the third question is attitudinal question. basically, these are questions that are interested in people's opinions and beliefs about something. One of the great and most common examples is the satisfaction questions. How satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the quality of teaching in certain course? Attitudinal questions are among these three are more challenging ones, both for the respondent, because it might require a little bit more effort to form and shape some opinion, especially when the topic is sensitive. So forming an opinion might take a little bit more effort than remembering just some fact that occurred or activity you engaged in. But it also can be challenging for the survey researcher to analyze, because there might be a number of biases involved. We will not talk about biases in this webinar, but it is also one of the things that can affect survey quality of survey data a lot. So when you are building a survey, make sure that it is not comprised of only attitudinal questions and a lot of attitudinal questions, because as I mentioned, this is quite demanding. It can be quite demanding for the respondents, and having a mixed and balanced different types of questions is always a good idea. Also, questions, they vary by the response category. Two major survey questions are closed-ended questions and open-ended questions. Closed-ended questions basically are questions that provide a set of responses, whereas in open-ended question, respondents have to type their answers. Closed-ended questions are usually favored by many survey researchers and the respondents. It's usually recommended to use, and closed-ended questions take many forms, shapes and forms. I just mentioned a few, like Likert scale, categorical question, multiple choice, ranking, rating. Whereas open-ended questions, they usually ask the respondent about certain topic. For example, what can the university do to improve your academic experience? We will talk a little bit more about examples of these closed-ended and open-ended questions further in this presentation today. So now we are moving to more practical part of the presentation. So when writing good survey questions, what are the things to avoid? First of all, please avoid overlapping response options. Okay, so if we look at the question that we considered before, how many times did you use Moodle in the last month? If we look at this set of responses, 1 to 10 times, 10 to 20 times, 20 to 30 times, more than 30 times, and did not use. What if somebody used the Moodle 10 times? Will they report their answer in the first response category or in the second response category? So making sure that response options do not ever overlap is very important. Rewarding it into, recategorizing it into 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, etc. It will yield much more, it will yield the quality data. This seems right now, when you look at it, it seems so clear, so obvious, so easy. However, it is a very simple and very common mistake. It usually happens when asking about age, about number of times somebody engaged in a certain activity, because when we think ahead, we can round it up, say 1 to 10, and then 10 to 20. It's quite understandable, I guess, But when translating it into a survey question, you need to make sure that the response options do not overlap. Because as I said, although it's very simple mistake, it actually happens quite often. Another thing to avoid when writing survey questions is using abbreviations, jargons, unfamiliar terms. Words and phrases can be unique to some institution or to a region, but if you are surveying population outside of this area, you need to be considerate about these terms or abbreviations. Or if you must include such specific terms or concept, please always provide a definition or an example. For example, if we're running a survey within NU, it's totally okay to use USM and CPS. I think most of the NU community might be familiar with it, but for people outside of NU or those who just recently joined NU, these terms can be tricky. So these are the things to also keep in mind. Another thing to try to avoid is multiple response questions. These are the questions where you can select unlimited number of response options. For example, what were the reasons for changing your job? And you can, as you can see in this example, you can select all 5 response options. Why this can cause some problems. First of all, multiple response questions don't measure intensity of response. So we see that all of these 5 factors were important for changing a job, but we don't know whether looking for a high salary was much more important compared to seeking a more positive work climate and environment. So you won't be able to compare which of these factors were the most important, most crucial. And the second, there is an issue of non-response bias. So let's take a look at the scenario when a respondent does not select anything from this list. Does it mean that none of these reasons that were provided in the list, they were important? Or does it mean that the person just skipped this question? So basically, because of this, using multiple response questions is not recommended. Of course, there are cases when you have to use it, and that's okay, but please always try to consider changing it into a categorical question. So asking about what was the most important reason for changing your job, and the respondent will select only one reason among the list. Or please consider changing the question into Likert scale matrix question. So when you be able to measure the intensity of each response option, for example, saying how important were these reasons for changing your job, and then the respondent will rate each reason ABC on a scale of non-important, somewhat important, and very important. Or another way to provide the scale is not label each scale, but provide endpoints. For example, 1 means not important and 5 means very important, and the person will select the corresponding scale. But this is one of the favored and recommended structures to use a Likert scale, and there are a couple things to consider when you use a Likert scale. First of all, as I mentioned before, it is important to label every response option. Especially, I think this is relevant when you have just numbers like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Sometimes there are cases when the numbers are not labeled, and it's not clear whether 1 means what does 1 mean and what does 5 mean. And for Likert scale, what is also good, there are a number of developed response categories. If you Google Likert scale, there are 3 scale, 4, 5, 7 scale, 7-point scales that developed on a number of different topics like importance, agreement, satisfaction, and things like that. So it is also, rather than trying to invent maybe, or in addition to trying to write everything from scratch, it's also a good idea to see what are the developed and available Likert scale response categories. So again, if you when you are writing a multiple response question, please reconsider whether it could be transformed into a categorical question when the person has to select only one reason, or at least into a question like this where they can measure the intensity of each response item. Another question to avoid is double-barreled questions. Double-barreled questions are questions that ask 2 issues in a single survey question. For example, was your instructor knowledgeable and helpful? This question can be very tricky to answer because there are instances where instructor is knowledgeable but not that helpful, and vice versa. So it is recommended to break down such questions into 2 parts. And one of the helpful tips is for spotting questions like this to look at words and or but in your question formulation. They could sometimes help to easily spot double-barreled questions. And another question that should be avoided at all costs when writing a good survey question is leading questions. Leading questions are questions that pushes the respondent to answer in a specific manner based on the way the question is framed. I think for this, I should show you examples. This I think shows very well. For example, the leading question can sound like, in general, how healthy are you? In this formulation, health rating is not neutral. It is skewed towards being healthy. And alternative neutral wording should be, in general, how would you rate your health? Because as I said, otherwise the question leans towards one direction, towards being healthy more than being unhealthy. Another example, to what extent do you agree with each of the following statements? This is something also very commonly I've seen very frequently. And again, to make this question more neutral, it is important to include to what extent do you agree or disagree with each of the following statements. I have to admit myself, I did make this mistake a couple times, and Feli pointed out to me this is very easy to forget or not pay attention to, but it is very important to state the both sides of the agreement or satisfaction scale. Another example is, we encourage employees to enhance their skills. Would you be interested in receiving training? In this question, the first sentence is should not be there. It has nothing to do with the question itself, but it leads the it can affect the respondent's answer to this question. So these are the things that we mark as a red flag, well, or things to avoid when writing a survey question. And further, I want to talk about things that you should be careful with, things that are we don't have a, well, there is no strong recommendation not to use it, but there are things to consider when using such survey question. First of all, open-ended question. This is something we've also talked a lot about on the previous webinar. Open-ended questions have their pros and cons, and for most of the surveys, especially large-scale surveys, the cons list can be more than pros. For example, open-ended questions are very time-consuming for the respondents. They actually have to type in their response, write something up. And since it's very time-consuming, many people might be tempted to skip it. That means you will be losing the data. And also it is time-consuming and quite challenging to code. As a survey researcher, when you receive your data and you have, for example, distribute your survey to 1,000 or 500 people and you get 200 or 300 responses, you have to manually go through each of them and code it. This is also will impose some challenges. But if you asking a very broad, tell us what you think question is a very bad idea. Even if you're using open-ended question, try to have a very specific, narrow focus. Tell us what you think about this service. Tell us what you think about the quality of something. Because having a very broad question will yield even more challenging results, even more difficult to analyze results. And also, when you have open-ended questions, also try to consider reframing it as a categorical question. Think about most common or most frequent response options that people might be having. And then, of course, you can also include the option of other and provide something for some exceptional cases when a respondent has to report something that was not captured within your response options. Second question is numeric questions. This is one type of an open-ended question. This is also an open-ended question, but it is shorter, meaning that the respondent is asked to provide a certain number, to type a certain number, like age, number of dependent children, graduation year from high school. Although this might seem easier task than having a very broad open-ended question, this can also impose challenges. Respondents can easily make a typo, like accidentally hit not the one number he or she was intended to, but the number next to it, or add press two numbers and add an extra digit. Also when setting up this question in Qualtrics, for example, on another online survey platform, you usually need to set some rules or boundaries, like it should be not less than this number, or for example, age, probably nobody should type in age 0 or age 1, and also provide whole number, not like a fraction, like 17.5 and things like that. So from a technical point of view, you have to do a lot more configuration, and also it is more difficult to analyze and group the responses. So when you have all sorts of numbers, and well, having groups of numbers will definitely make your analysis part easier rather than having to analyze the raw numbers provided by the respondents. So when you have numeric questions, please also consider about the challenges that might happen during, both for the respondent and, well, instances of error that can happen when the respondent answers, and also the challenges that can happen during the analysis. Another questions that you should be careful with is ranking questions. Ranking questions ask the respondents to put a list of things in order. Ranking questions are usually quite confusing for the respondent, especially when the list of response options is very long. Also, even if the respondent answers your question, this information does not provide the insights how they rate on each item. Only you can see the relative to each other. For example, if a student rates their favorite sports and they rank football as number 1 and volleyball as number 2 and basketball number 3, but you don't know how much, like maybe they like football like very much, 5 out of 5, and they like volleyball 2 out of 5, even though it's a second in the list. So you cannot learn the intensity of the responses, only information about response categories relative to each other. And also, when you do the analysis and an interpretation of the ranking questions, it's also not as straightforward as using other like multiple choice questions or Likert scale questions. Now we move to the final part of our presentation. I know we're a little bit running short on time, but I think we started a little bit late. So I think I hope most of us can stay with us for 5 to 10 more minutes, hopefully. So general guidelines to writing good survey questions. First of all, do not ask questions that are not relevant to your study objectives. Second, each question must focus on one and only one issue or study objective. So don't, as we mentioned, don't throw in several issues or several items in one survey question. The next is make each question as specific and as clear as possible with clear instructions. It is also very crucial to provide clear instructions and to leave little to no room to ambiguity. So the respondent at the very beginning, at the comprehension stage of the mental process of answering, will have no problems to understand the question you were asking. Also, questions that ask participants to recall a behavior or a fact from memory should focus on a limited, recent period of time. This is just as we talked before. Please specify a time period and also consider how much time has passed since the event. Know how it can affect the quality of the responses. The next is use words, terms that all respondents understand. Try to avoid abbreviations, specific terms, or jargons. The next is be neutral in the question formulation. Don't ask leading questions. The survey research needs to be as neutral as possible, have no biases in order to get the true data without pushing the respondent into one or another direction. In terms of types of question, as we said before, use open-ended questions sparingly. This, as I said, this is quite challenging both for the respondent and for the researcher, and opting for close-ended questions is recommended, although of course there are cases when open-ended questions need to be used, but be very careful and when you use open-ended questions. The next is try to use Likert scale or categorical questions. Even among closed-ended questions, there are questions that are more favorable. These are Likert scaled or categorical questions because it's easier for the respondent and for the survey researcher because Likert scale or categorical questions are of course more in favor than ranking or numeric questions. Also avoid questions that ask respondents to select more than one response. As we mentioned, this creates a non-response bias and can affect the quality of your data. And last but not least, also when writing good survey questions, you need to write good response options. with response or answer categories. First of all, please label every scale. Next, try to use negative to positive scale. This is in regard to Likert scale. So when you do satisfaction, try to start from dissatisfaction towards satisfaction, from strongly disagreeing to strongly agreeing. There is a, sorry, I forgot the term. I think something called left skewness bias or something like this. In survey research, this is something has been proven that people, when answering a question, if the Likert scale is horizontal, people tend to skew towards the left. And when you have, for example, strongly agreeing to strongly disagreeing, this might affect, actually skew your data to more of a positive direction. So using negative to positive scale is also a good idea. It's recommended. Also using response rating scales. Examine response scales already developed. As I mentioned, a lot of the agreement, satisfaction scales, there are many versions available out there online. Please look it up. It can be very helpful to use what has been already developed and tested, but also don't do it blindly. Of course, there is always a need to adjust everything according to your needs, to your survey. Another important point is to provide all possible response options. Response options have to be as exhaustive as it is possible, and sometimes using the last option as other is also very helpful. And response options must be mutually exclusive. Please do not let response options to overlap, because it will create a lot of confusion for the respondents. This is it for today's presentation. I will be happy to answer some questions, or if we have more time, I have created just 3 sample questions, and the audience could tell us, examine and tell whether something is wrong with these questions, or what are the mistakes that were made. So, but first, yeah, let's see if there are any questions that needs some answering.
Thank you very much, Banu. That's great. Any questions? And these simple tips that Banu provided are issues that we see repeatedly. Recently, I think it was this semester or maybe at the end of last semester, I saw an institutional-wide survey in which none of the response options had been labeled. So that kind of survey yields data that cannot be useful at all. In fact, you can't even interpret the information. So if you simply ask people to rate, I don't know, satisfaction from 1 to 5, without telling them what 1 stands for, at the minimum, what 1 and 5 stand for, at the very minimum, then the data will not be interpretable. That's basically useless data. You can't make the case that satisfaction is high or satisfaction is low. You really can't make the case based on that information. So this is something I think that people really need to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions, comments, observations, experiences, good and bad?
Okay.
Okay, I will take this as a sign that everything was perfectly clear.
Well, I kind of want to test that. When you provide an example and you tell immediately what needs to be fixed, of course it seems so obvious, but I kind of want to check
yes, Manu, go ahead.
And see. Okay, so what do you think about this survey question?
it has already, well, what was the term for setting, like you already say that it was warm and safe. So can they give prejudice? The question should be restated.
Yes, yes.
And also, well,
The complete wording of the question is wrong. It should be, there are no clear instructions what the person has to do. It should be stated as, please rate your, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement. Good. This is one of the, yeah, something that you can spot probably immediately.
Yes, that's something that is also very common, that I see very, very commonly in surveys that come to my inbox, where you wonder, so what is the respondent expected to do with this question? But there is something else. I don't know if someone else can weigh in.
Answers, there is no agree and disagree, just simple agree and disagree answer type.
Okay, very limited choice of response options, yes?
Yeah, that's good. Anything else?
Anything else?
Yeah, yes, Aijan, I think, noticed it, saying that it has two questions combined together.
Yes,
right.
Very good.
Double barrel question. So here, are you really, is the respondent supposed to focus on warm or on safe? They can't focus on both. So again, this is something that you need to pay very close attention to. It's something that occurs quite frequently. Even sometimes with experienced survey designers, it's always some of these aspects that you really want to have a second look at, because it can, you never know when you might be asking a double barrel question. So it helps to have maybe someone else check your wording. And as Vanu said, pay attention to how you use terms like and, or, but, because that usually signals that you are asking about two things.
Yes, good. Okay. What about the next question? Okay, so these are we'll have to drag and drop. Do you think you would be comfortable answering this question, or everybody would be on campus, given that this is a campus survey among campus residents or a new community?
Anyone, any issues with this question?
I'm sorry, may I tell? Yes, my name is Tendik. I represent the library. Yes, I think this question quite a bit, no, it must be specified, because, for example, what is favorite, what is not favorite, it must be food or quality of coffee or environment, I mean furniture. It should be specified, I think.
Yes. Sure, yes, it could be more specific criteria for selecting the favorite coffee shop, okay? Sure. That could be one of the ways to improve this question, definitely.
Anything else that you can spot?
Okay, let me comment on one thing. This is a ranking question. As I mentioned in the presentation, you need to be careful with ranking questions because they might be confusing. However, in this question, there are only 3 items. So answering to particular these questions with only 3 items might be okay for the respondent. However, if we would have had all the like 5 or like 8 coffee shops, then ranking can become quite confusing and challenging for the respondent. So I think for this question, and again, you have to, there is no certain like right or wrong. It is for your, this is the survey researcher that needs to think, okay, this might be one way to ask this question, but how will I interpret the results? This is is it exactly what kind of the information you are looking for, and you understand the challenges and pros and cons of structuring your question in this way. So it's not, I mean, it's nothing, it's not a mistake, it's just something I just want to highlight sort of and pay your attention to.
Yeah, ranking questions can be very, very difficult to analyze if you don't have a sufficiently sort of strong knowledge of statistics. Those can be very, very tricky, especially if you find yourself, I mean, here it's only one item basically, but in some cases you might have multiple items where you need to rank them according to different criteria, and it can be very tricky to analyze this type of data. I've seen some ranking questions in previous surveys and some analysis of those questions that were not really accurate. So just be careful with ranking questions. If you feel you won't be able to analyze the data, you might want to check with someone who knows how to do that, because these are very tricky questions to analyze.
And another comment I would like to make is this response option HP, although it is probably most of us did not have a problem understanding what does it mean HP, referring to a health project coffee shop. However, it might not be clear to everyone. This is an abbreviation, informal one. For somebody who, for example, lives in the residential blocks, do not come to the main campus a lot, they are not familiar with this abbreviation, this might create a confusion. So in instances like this, in this question, there is absolutely no need to use the abbreviation. Spelling out the entire name of this coffee shop is absolutely easily doable and strongly recommended. And last example. Oops, there is a misspelling, your satisfaction, sorry. Typo.
Well, it can be part of the test. if people can spot the missing R.
It's probably the same that you mentioned, that there is no definition for 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5.
Yes, absolutely correct. It is unclear what does 1 mean and what does 5 mean.
Yeah, so if you run a survey like that, the data that you get will be uninterpretable. Even if you find that the average is 4, you cannot make the case that the satisfaction, that people are satisfied. Even if you get a perfect 5, you cannot make the case that the level of satisfaction is 4. Because there is simply no contextual information to convince anyone that that's actually the case. In the end, you might end up with data that you think will be useful, but in reality, it's no longer the case.
And there is one more thing, at least that I have in mind, if somebody can spot it.
How about the way the question itself is formulated? Other than the missing R, of course, but.
Yeah.
For satisfaction and dissatisfaction.
Yes.
Right.
Bingo, Medina. Yes, that is correct.
So, yeah.
This
And
question.
may I also comment? I'm sorry, but I think I'm looking as a person for whom this question is, yes, for me. And
Mhm.
I'm thinking, IT services, it is one, there are different kind of services here. IT, it is information services, yes, like technical, my computer does not work and so on. Food services, it is another kind of services, absolutely another. Parking, it is also, all these three services, they have their own specific features. And I think it's, as for me, I cannot, for example, put right now these 1 or 2 or 3, 4, 5, because they are absolutely different. That's why we need again to how to say, to уточнять, to make clear, make clear. What do you mean, for example, politeness of the people who make these services, or do you mean quality of the service, like quality of food and quality of these IT, yes, services, or parking, like quality also, no, they have also different kind of specific features. That is why this is too, как это, рыхлая, too weird question for these services, which are very different services, very different. Well, this is my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. No. I agree with you. It's. I just throw in here, and yeah, I was wondering if somebody will comment on this. Of course, IT service is quite not clear. What does it mean? Definitely, whether it's the quality of IT support or how responsive they are, and so on and so on. Same with food service and parking service. But sometimes, of course, every survey researcher would like to dig in and be able to evaluate certain aspects from all the different angles, but usually it will lengthen the survey length. It will make it longer, and longer the survey, the participants might get tired and not to answer. So it is critical to assess what is the main thing that you want to ask your respondents about. Whether IT is your main focus. If it is, then break it down into several, like direct support, Moodle support, classroom equipment, and so on, and have some subcategories. But in some cases, unfortunately, you have to lump into some broad general statement. Although I agree, it's still even the general statement needs to be more clear. So when the respondent is answering, they will have a very good understanding of what they're being asked about. So yes, Indika, I agree with you that some of these, the wordings of response categories as it is might leave more questions rather than help the respondent to answer this question. So.
Yeah, those are very good observations, indeed. So in the end, really, you need to consider the overall purpose of your survey. Typically, if it's a generic survey that asks people about the level of satisfaction with different aspects, you can get away with this kind of item because, I mean, you are only aiming to have a sense of how satisfied or dissatisfied they are with the whole system. But if your focus is like you really want to dig into IT services, or you want to develop a survey that digs more into different aspects, then yes, it is absolutely crucial that you think about different dimensions or different aspects that make up IT services, and which of these dimensions we'll be focusing on. But yes, it's an excellent observation that people need to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes in our generic surveys, like in our student surveys, which are already very long, we don't want necessarily to dig into different aspects of IT services, or even food services, or even parking services, but just maybe sort of have a sense of what students think about these services in general as they experience them. And I see also an interesting observation in the chat, someone who says, what if I don't have a car?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is important.
Mm-hmm.
So in a natural survey, you want to think about that. Remember what we talked about? We talked about the importance of sort of determining whether there are assumptions embedded in our survey questions or response categories. And in this case, yes. If someone doesn't have a car, they might not be able to respond to this question. In that case, you might want to include a non-applicable option, which we typically include like on our student surveys. So yeah, you might want to add a non-applicable question for people who did not use IT services, for instance, or those who did not use food services, or those who did not use parking services.
Mm-hmm.
That's also a good observation.
Mm-hmm. I also noticed a comment by Saltanat. What if none of them is favorite? None of the coffee shop is favorite. This is exactly what I talked about during the presentation, that the ranking questions do not provide you an opportunity to measure the intensity. So if you word your question as a ranking question, you cannot, maybe somebody doesn't like all of these three coffee shops, but when you put the question in a ranking format, it does not allow you to capture this information. So this is one of the downsides, or one of the costs of this question. And when you are if you are writing a ranking question, you need to clearly understand that this might occur. So.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I see another observation in the chat about some literature suggesting to avoid odd numbers, like having, for instance, a Likert scale that consists of 5 points, like here. Because in some cases, yes, it is true. I mean, there is a lot of discussions among survey methodologists whether it is appropriate to have, let's say, a 5-point scale rather than a 6-point scale. Is it preferable to have an odd number or an even number? This is a debate that is still ongoing. I personally tend to stay away from odd numbers, especially if it's a ranking from 1 to 5. With a ranking from 1 to 7, yes, I would use that kind of ranking, but my preference would be to use 6 points instead of 5, or even instead of 7. Because in some cases, the middle point, some participants use it as an easy escape. They don't want to put in sort of the cognitive energy that they need to really think about the question and how best they can answer it, and then they would just select the middle category. That can happen. But also it depends on the response categories that you are using. In some cases, if your response categories are clearly not overlapping, for instance, if you have so if you have somewhat agree and somewhat disagree, or you have a scale in which you can clearly tell the difference between one category and another. For instance, between category 3 and 4 and between category 3 and 2. If the difference is perfectly clear to the respondents, I think you would be justified in using a 5-point. But if it is not, if 3 is sort of serving just as a neutral category, meaning, for instance, neither agree nor disagree, definitely I would stay away from that. I wouldn't use that middle category. So you see what I mean? So basically you need to want to ask yourself, is the middle category just serving as a neutral position? So if it is serving as a neutral position, then you would probably want to stay away from it and use 4 points or 6 points instead. But if it's not a neutral position and it's a perfectly valid sort of response option, that is clearly semantically different from 2 and from 4, then that's okay. But yeah, it's a good observation. There is a lot of discussion among survey methodologists about this. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Just one comment concerning the odd number of points, for example. As for me, I think it's not a big, for example, difference between 5 points or 7 points from point of view that usually people, they think, if they think that it is so-so, then they put the point in the middle. In 5, between 1 and 5, 3 is in the middle. It is satisfactory, right? 4 is good and 5 is excellent. 3 is satisfactory. It means so-so, not so very good, not so very bad, but it is 3. And if, for example, points 7, same person will put in such situation, the same situation, he will put number 4. It is like in the middle among the 7 points. It's just my, how to say, my opinion. I think so.
Yes,
but nevertheless, thank you for your comments.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. I mean, there's been some research that have, some researchers that have looked into this. Does the distribution of responses differ whether you put 5? So if you have, for instance, a satisfaction, dissatisfaction scale, on a scale from 1 to 5, as opposed to a scale from 1 to 7, will the distribution of responses remain the same? For instance, does the 3 on a 5-point scale necessarily translate into a 4 on a 7-point scale? There is some discussion about that, and no agreement. It's interesting. It's something that is open for experimentation. So if you are interested in survey research, you can actually design a survey to sort of test this, sort of see if the distribution of responses would be consistent between the two scales that you are using. But in general, so everything really depends also on how you want to use the survey. So if you are using your survey for academic research, then of course there has to be a lot more considerations that we need to pay with respect to decisions on whether to use a 4-point scale or a 7-point scale. If you are using a survey for administrative purpose, you really need to ask yourself how you will be, what you will be doing with the data. What do you want to get from the data? Are you just interested in distinguishing between those who are satisfied from those who are not satisfied? So if that's your purpose for an administrative survey position, simply use a 4-point scale on a satisfaction, dissatisfaction scale, 4-point, because that is very clear. You'll be able to distinguish between those who are satisfied and those who are not satisfied. But if it is a very large sample size, like a population that is quite large, and you are doing the survey for academic research purposes, then you will be hammered a little bit in terms of, because people would want to know, why is it that you prefer to use a 4-point scale rather than an extended scale? That gives you more flexibility to have a range of responses. So yeah, so it also depends on how you will be using the data.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I don't hear any questions. And it's 4:30, we'll probably just end here. And thank you very much, Banu, for the overview. That was excellent. And thank you all for attending. The recording will be made available on the IR website, probably shortly. And there will be other seminars or webinars that will be offering around this topic, because I mean, it's a very broad topic. Here, Banu focused on giving you really some of the very practical issues that you can consider as you write your survey questions. But please, again, check out the first recordings, especially the importance of having a good survey purpose, clearly defined research questions, and understanding the survey life cycle. Those are very crucial aspects, I think, that you need to bear in mind as you develop your instruments. Okay?
Thank you, everyone. I will send the presentation to everyone who signed up, who registered, but the recording is, and yeah, I think we can put up the presentation maybe as well to the website. Just check the website. That will be your best source to look.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, and bye-bye.
Bye.